Okay, so one thing that I want to stress right away is that task 3 of week 7 is not an essay. So please make sure that you are not stressing or creating anxiety for yourself by failing to recognize that this task 3 is just a paragraph long. That said, this paragraph has to be really solid, really focused, really compelling, really precise. You really have to show that you are able to build on your understanding of utilitarianism from the ebook by following and acquiring further information and insights from the 2 lectures that you have to pull from in completing this task. Please be sure to listen to all of this video so that you can make sure that you properly understand what it is that you are supposed to do. So at this point in the week 7 bundle and or whatever week this happens to be for your section, whatever semester, whatever year we're in, at this point of the task, you should have already read through all of this on your own. You should have already followed these 2 lectures. So these are the 2 lectures that you have to pull from, and these are the only approved sources for this assignment. And of course, you know that from reading all of this. So if you haven't done so yet, please be sure to read all of this carefully and then to read all of this carefully. To follow this and take notes since you need to use the notes from this. Make sure that when you are using the notes from these 2 lectures, that you are not distorting or misrepresenting anything that I say that Bentham says. You don't want to say something that distorts what I say or that misrepresents me or anything that distorts Bentham or presents something that is false about Bentham or twists it or something like that. Now, this is where we're at right now. This is the part that we're going to focus on, getting the specific requirements for the content I expect to see in your paragraph long evaluation. So here I stress that it's only a paragraph long. Again, this is not an essay. This means there's no introductory paragraph. That means there's no closing paragraph or summary. So in this class, we don't write essays. We don't do research papers. What we do is we focus on the meat of what needs to be said in a reading assignment. We go straight to the meat of what it is that we could put in an essay. So that said, I'm going to read through this with you, and we are going to take notes. So make sure that you take notes along with me, as take notes as I read through this. You might even want to get a sheet of paper and start with prompt. So write down prompt and then write down any notes. I recommend that you actually copy the prompt. Copy all of this in handwriting and take notes. You can copy this and then you can pause the video, copy this, and then take notes, or you could just write prompt and then take notes. But another suggestion is that you could copy this, into a Word document and then take notes in Word. You could print this somehow. You could do screen capture and then print it and then take notes on your screen capture if you print it. So you get the idea. All right, so remember that I do provide missing requirements, tips, and warnings in a video, or often in a video. So let's look at the prompt. You are going to use intellectual empathy to discuss how Jeremy Bentham, and I need to correct this, so this will be corrected by the time you get to the video, how Jeremy Bentham would critique your response to item 3 of the week 2 assignment, the one you clarified for task 1 of this bundle. Okay, so when I say use intellectual empathy, that should ring a bell. So remember, that's an intellectual virtue where you are willing and able to put yourself in the rational and conceptual place of another. That means that you're able to identify the fundamental and the words that name fundamental and powerful concepts in somebody else's thinking or theory, in the case of Jeremy Bentham, and that you're able to understand how they might think through their concepts to reach various conclusions given the way they think about their concepts, the way they structure their concepts and whatnot. Now, as soon as I say how Jeremy Bentham would critique you, and I talk about concepts in virtue of talking about intellectual empathy, you should automatically be thinking about the lectures on his utilitarianism. That said, I want you to understand that it is so important that you use intellectual empathy because you are literally trying to take on Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism as I lectured on it and as you read about it, to evaluate, to make sense of your argument about driving through a line of protesters, even if you said it was not rational for you to decide. Intellectual empathy is so important because you might not agree with Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. You might be more of a Kantian or an Aristotelian when it comes to how we decide what action is right or wrong, or what is the morally correct action, or what's morally permissible. In any case, whether you agree with Bentham or not, you still have to practice intellectual empathy because you really have to make sure that you understand how his theory works. That's what I did, the lectures that I did for you. I wanted to make sure that you really understood what the principle of utility is saying and what it means to think like Jeremy Bentham through that principle, and of course, linked to that, what the hedonic calculus is all about and how it relates to the principle of utility. So you are not giving your own opinions about moral theory. Rather, you're using his moral theory. You're using the words from his theory that name fundamental and powerful concepts to make sense of your response. So you'll be analyzing your response. How would he analyze it? How would he take it apart? What would he focus on? And in virtue of that analysis, how would he go beyond that to evaluate your response? Would he say that it has some strengths and some weaknesses? If so, what would be some of the strengths? What would be some of the weaknesses? Would he say that your response is way off? Well, why so? Would he say that your response is 100% aligned with what he says in the principle of utility? What he says we should do with what he says, how he says we should calculate things to meet the principle of utility via the hedonic calculus? So again, you're not using your own moral values, your own moral concepts to evaluate your response. You're using Jeremy Bentham's ideas, his concepts, to analyze and evaluate your response. And that's why intellectual empathy is important in doing so. So you really have to make sure that you've taken really good notes with those lecture points. Okay, so another thing that I need to stress to you is this. You are not applying utilitarianism to the original prompt. So remember, the original prompt had the scenario about you being a truck driver and a line of protesters blocking the freeway, and that children were going to die of COVID if you didn't get the medicine to them, right? And so I asked you, is it morally permissible? Do you think it's morally permissible for you to drive through the line of protesters? And what some students do in this assignment is they'll tell me what Jeremy Bentham would conclude. They'll tell me what they think Jeremy Bentham's answer would be to that question. But that is not the point of this task. I don't want you to tell me how a utilitarian might respond to that question. I don't want you to tell me how Jeremy Bentham might argue for that conclusion. That's not what we're doing. We are using Jeremy Bentham to look at the reasoning, the logic that you used in your argument. So you're going to want to go back to the lecture notes, video 1. Would he say that for example, so using video 1, would he find that you stated or made explicit a general moral principle? Yes or no? If so, would he say that your general moral principle aligns with the one that we went over, his general moral principle of utility that we went over in video 1? Is that immoral, if not explicitly? Is it implicit in your thinking, that general moral principle? Or do you have some other general moral principle, one that's maybe focused on duty ethics and deontology? So if you focused on certain duties, then you're not, technically speaking, you're probably not a utilitarian. What about the key ideas from video 1? Would he find that you considered all involved, including yourself? That you considered all the people that could be directly involved or indirectly involved? If so, cite from your response. If not, then say that. Say, what would he say you might have failed to consider? What about considering 2 possible courses of action? What about comparing the results? What about looking at all the different factors? So again, go back. What I'm appealing to is all the stuff from video 1, but also you need to be thinking in terms of video 2 in the hedonic calculus. Think about the major points of emphasis that were made during video 2. Go back to your notes. That is his thinking. So knowing what you know about his thinking with respect to the principle of utility and the way I broke it down for you in the hedonic calculus, what might he notice in your reasoning? Would he notice that you used a general moral principle? If so, is it his general moral principle? If not, is it implied? If not, which general moral principle? Well, what's the problem with that? Did you use a hedonic calculus or something like it? Did you consider pros and cons? So I'm trying to give you a sense of how this works. But again, do not make this a thing where you tell me how Jeremy Bentham would answer the original question, whether it was morally permissible for you or even him or anyone to drive through the line of protesters. No, we are pretending that Jeremy Bentham's reading your response as a utilitarian and analyzing it to see that you applied the proper principle, all its components, and the hedonic calculus to reach your particular moral judgment. Now, technically, if you did item 3 correctly, then what you have in your item 3 response in the first sentence, if you picked a definite position, what you have is a particular moral judgment. So if you said, I think it would be morally permissible, or you said, I think it would not be morally permissible, that is your particular moral judgment. And so you should use that language. What would he say? Would he say that you reasoned through or gave proper support for your particular moral judgment? I should see those words, particular moral judgment. I should see general moral principle. Did you provide one or not? Did you use his key concepts to think through things? Did you use his method? Blah, blah, blah. All right, so that said, I'm trying to think if there's anything else in here that I want to share with you. I might have some other things that I want to bring up with respect to that, but let's go ahead and look more at some content requirements. So it does say use your notes from the Step 2 video lectures to create a coherent, compelling paragraph in responding to the prompt above, which is right here. Okay, so part 1, copy and paste what you submitted for task 1 of this bundle, the markup and the reformat. No patterns, no diagrams. This goes at the top of your response above your discussion paragraph, and I will correct this by the time you get to this video. Note, I do not want you to submit part 1 separately from part 2. This goes into the same submission, the same document, okay, or like the same page as this part right here. So it's all one thing. The idea is that when you're discussing and analyzing and evaluating your argument from the perspective of Jeremy Bentham, I need to see what your response was, because you can say things that are not compelling, that you can make claims about what he would say about your argument that are not sufficient, you don't provide enough evidence, or maybe you distort something that he said as you're analyzing and evaluating your response from his perspective. So I need to see your response right there. Oh yeah, I remembered that something here is that, somehow, you need to make sure that you mention his name. You need to make sure that you mention the name of his theory. You need to make sure that you mention the name of his principle at least, if not cite it. And then you need to make sure that you name his method, maybe say something about it, okay? That said, another thing, very important, let's go back up here. Do not just summarize his theory. If all you do is summarize the lecture notes and that's it, you're going to fail this task. Again, if you're not just summarizing the theory and you're not applying his theory to answer the original question at issue that you were addressing. Rather, you are pulling from key aspects of the lectures, the ideas, the principles, the terms to analyze and evaluate to make sense of your argument from his perspective. Okay, so going back down to this part right here. Okay, so immediately below part 1, that is on one and the same document submission, present your paragraph-long response to the prompt above, right there. You're going to produce at least 6 sentences, but not more than 8 to create a short discussion that is clear, accurate, precise, sufficient, substantive. That means that you cannot be fluffy because you've got to get all of the important points in you've got to get all your important points out there within a 6 to 8 sentence limit, right? So you should be able to say what you need to say within 8 sentences. Now, how many statements you put into 8 statements or 6 statements, that's you. So if you want to put one statement, if you want only one statement per sentence, that's fine. If you want to put 2 statements in per sentence, that's fine. Ultimately, the sentence and statement numbers don't matter. okay? But I give that as a kind of gauge for you with respect to providing a substantive enough, thorough enough discussion. Now, you're not going to necessarily be able to discuss everything and anything that Bentham could possibly say about your response. If there's a lot of things that you feel you could say or that you notice you could say about your response and how he might analyze and evaluate your response, it's better to focus on one or two things and to go really in depth to really tease out the things that you want to say. You'll get a lot more points for that. If you just give me a list of, he said this, so he would agree with what I said here, and just give me a mere list of things like that, you're not going to get a good grade on this. It's better to say, well, he believes this, and so he would find that that's lacking in my response, and so he would, blah, blah, blah. And so this would be an issue for them. He would have a problem with this, or he might critique me for this, or whatever. So it's all about the language of he would say. In looking at my response, he might note that I did this, that I failed to do this. He might say that while I didn't use the word happiness, I imply it when I said, quote, blah, blah, blah in my response. Okay, so that brings us to some other content expectations that I have. At least half of your sentences should explain, elaborate, tease out ideas. Refer to something specific about his theory that is something, I'll correct this by the time you get to this video, something stated or lectured on in step 2, video 1, as well as video 2. So I'm already at the 16-minute mark in this video, so I'm not going to redo it to correct these typos, but they will be fixed by the time you get to this. Refer to specific details in your item 3 argument response using quotation marks if you need to quote yourself. So it's not a list just to say, it's not enough just to say, he said this, I said this. You need to tell me what is the connection here. Okay, so you might quote something about his theory and then quote something about your theory, but you need to tell me what you're trying to achieve with those two quotes. Why are you telling me this about his theory and then telling me this? Are you going to tell me that he pays attention to X and he notices that you paid attention to it explicitly or implicitly? Explain. Are you going to tell me that he thinks considering Y is important? And then you need to tell me something specific from your response. Is he going to praise you for showing attention to this thing that he thinks is important, whether it's implicit or explicit? Explain. So again, it's better to focus maybe on one or two things that he might say about your response and really go in depth with one or two things rather than just a list of generic fuzzy comments that really don't shed light on why he would analyze and evaluate your response the way that you could otherwise develop your discussion, or in a way that you could otherwise develop your discussion. Okay, so try your best to use proper syntax, to use proper writing conventions and mechanics to avoid run-on sentence fragments and comma splices. If you have a couple of typos, like we saw a few typos in here, you're not going to get, any points off for 3 little tiny things like I have. However, if you have that plus run-ons and or plus sentence fragments and or plus comma splices, then that becomes an issue. Or if it's just really hard to follow your grammar. Little tiny things, 3 or 4 little typos, I'm not going to care about, but then after that it becomes a problem. Be careful not to plagiarize in any way. So make sure that you adhere to what I say about approved sources and how to document where you're getting ideas that you paraphrase and or ideas that you state in direct quotes. As long as you do this, you're going to be fine. It's better to get points off for not saying enough or quoting too much than to get a 0 for this assignment because you plagiarized intentionally or otherwise. So I'm really strict about that. All right, so let's talk about formatting and submitting. Make sure that your paragraph is left aligned. Do not center align. That makes it really difficult to read your response. Let's go ahead and look at that in the link right here. So when you are submitting your response, you can do it in 2 ways. You can use the write submission function, or you can browse local files. So I'm giving you permission to use whatever you prefer. Just remember that whatever you do, if you're attaching files, I want only one file, one document with both parts. If you're using Write Submission, just make sure that you have both parts, that you post both parts within the single space within the single submission. When I say left justify, I am talking about, let's say you have a paragraph, right? Then it should be centered to the left, right? Sometimes students will give me a response and it'll be center justified. That is just not acceptable. It makes it really difficult, especially if you have lines way out here and way out here. Also, do not bold your entire response. That also makes it difficult. I would also like for you to use Arial or Times New Roman font, and I would like for you to use 10 or 12-point font. Otherwise, I find the other fonts way too distracting. I'm used to Arial and Times New Roman. Also, using smaller fonts can make it hard to read. Even when I zoom in, it can mess up my other information on the screen, like the rubric. And so I can't read what's in the rubric if I have to zoom in a lot to see what you typed up, and vice versa. If it's too big, then I have to minimize the screen, and then I still might not be able to see properly what's on the other side. And so actually I meant to say if I have to zoom in too much, it can make the wording in my rubrics and whatnot too big. If I have to zoom out, then it can make my rubric and the wording in that too small. Give me just a second. Okay. So don't forget that if you do the Write Submission option, don't forget that in any case, whether you attach a file or do the Write Submission, that you click right here. I agree to submit my papers. So of course there's a plagiarism checker. And then don't forget to click submit. Do not, as always, do not post your response in the comment section. You can add a note, you can give me a heads up, you can ask a question there if you want, but that's it. And don't forget that you can review the grading rubric that I use to evaluate your response. Of course, the rubric, it's not just a writing rubric, it's also a thinking rubric, and that you want to look at this rubric and keep in mind, the context, the instructions, the prompt, the expectation, and the requirements given with respect to, how you will be evaluated. So I'm trying to look and see if there's anything I've forgotten. Yes, there's one last thing. If you're not interested in extra credit, you are done. There's nothing else for you to listen to. However, if you would like some extra credit, go ahead and continue to listen. So if you would like extra credit, something that you can do has to do with part 1. What you can do is you can label the statements in your argument markup and your argument reformat. So what do I mean by that? So let's say you have your argument. For each statement, you can tell me if it's a moral statement. You can tell me if it's a non-moral statement. Where are you going to put these labels? These labels would come after the statement number and the statement label. So let's say you have statement 1, you labeled it as a final conclusion, and let's say you say it's a moral statement. Then you need to also tell me what kind of a moral statement it is. So you will get credit if you tell me that something is you will get credit if you have a moral statement for statement 1 and it is a moral statement. You'll get a bonus point. But you can get more points by going in depth. So remember from the lecture that I did that you took notes on earlier in the semester that moral statements can be broken down into 2 parts. So let's say you decide that this first statement in your argument is a particular moral judgment. Then you can include that label as well. So you would do this both in your argument markup, but also in your reformatted version. So let's say, you have P1 in the reformat. Then what you would do is you would add those labels at the beginning. So you would do moral statement, PMJ, premise 1. So again, to get extra credit then, you add these labels. You can just stick to moral statement, and then the other one, non-moral statement. If you want even more credit, if something's a moral statement, you can differentiate between moral statements that are particular moral judgments and statements that are general moral principles. Hint, like I said earlier in the lecture, if you did this assignment correctly and you picked a definite position, then you should actually have this as your first statement. A final conclusion, or a conclusion if you have a simple argument, and that conclusion would be a moral statement in the form of a particular moral judgment. I'll give you extra credit just for listening to this video and knowing that that's the answer, provided you did the item 3 response correctly. Is there anything else I want to say about extra credit? I'm not going to give any feedback on extra credit unless you request it during office hours. I could do that. I could send you a little video. It would be very short. It wouldn't be explanatory. I would just tell you what was correct or incorrect. I think that's all I have. If you are someone who said that it was not rational for you to decide whether it be morally permissible to drive through the protesters, I am going to make an additional 5-minute video that helps you with respect to the main prompt and requirements for this task. I just ended my video. What's up? Are you done?
Yeah. Why?
Because I love you.
Oh my God.